Curfew is now in effect. All unauthorized citizens must stay indoors.
Tensions rise as we enter the 213th week of lockdown.
A grim new reality emerges.
COVID-23 has mutated.
Beginning thermal scan. Thermal scan normal.
A horrifying new development
New
today.
data confirms the virus attacks the brain tissue.
Hey, whoa, I'm immune! I'm immune!
Worldwide death toll rises to over 110 million.
All infected Americans are being forced into quarantine camps.
Sarah, what's going on?
Department of Sanitation.
Sarah, talk to me.
I think my neighbor has a fever.
It'll be so much easier if you just open the door. Mrs. Grant, you have visitors.
Sarah, please. Sarah, open that door. Sarah, do not open that door.
As viruses multiply, they change. And the same is happening to the coronavirus.
All viruses mutate, and that is to be expected.
Scientists have been tracking those mutations while following coronavirus's journey around the world. Some of the mutations help the virus to spread, others do nothing at all. But as coronavirus multiplies and changes, could it also become more deadly?
The new coronavirus, like all other viruses, is constantly mutating as it replicates inside its human host. The virus uses us to multiply by injecting its genetic information into our cells. The cell then becomes a kind of virus factory, mass-producing the genetic material that allows more of the virus to develop. As the virus replicates, mistakes are often made. Errors mean the genetic material changes, causing a mutated version of the virus. If those changes are advantageous, the mutation will go on to spread.
Researchers from a hospital near Paris looked back at people hospitalized in December of 2019 and early January 2020, looking for patients with symptoms and CAT scan findings that were consistent with COVID-19. Remember, back then, no one had any test for COVID-19 and no one thought it had gone beyond China. They identified a 42-year-old man with findings consistent with COVID-19 who was admitted on December 27th with 4 days of symptoms. The frozen samples taken at that time were retested and they were positive for SARS-CoV-2. Now this man had no history of travel, and that suggests SARS-CoV-2 was in the Paris area at least 4 days before the first announcement of the virus in Wuhan, China on December 31st. Now, on the topic of how long SARS-CoV-2 might have been around, a new study from the UK that looked at natural mutations in the virus found the virus may have been circulating as early as October of 2019, although that time frame is based on modeling estimates and only provides a hint of when the virus entered circulation, not proof. The paper also identified nearly 200 recurrent mutations that the researchers believe are helping the virus evolve and adapt to infecting humans. Yeah, now finally, I want to mention a third study that has been widely reported but has not been peer-reviewed and is very preliminary. The paper actually suggests that mutations in the spike protein, which is critical for the virus to invade human cells, might be making it more infectious and might cause difficulty creating a vaccine. The paper also identified nearly 200 recurrent mutations that the researchers believe are helping the virus evolve.
Scientists have been expecting the virus that causes COVID-19 to mutate, and there is now new research that suggests one of the dominant strains, the strains found here in Canada, is in fact mutating and is in fact now more infectious.
Scientists have discovered hundreds of mutations to the virus that causes COVID-19. Researchers in the UK found almost 200 recurrent genetic mutations, which could mean a more contagious strain of the novel coronavirus.
We need to make sure that our army is ready to go to war. And we're going to make sure that our soldiers are ready. We have an obligation to do that, so they will continue to train. As this morning, we've had 992 soldiers from all three components test positive for the COVID-19 virus. And as of this morning, we have 14 out of our 15 urban augmentation medical task forces employed. We'll manage the risk. We don't have a vaccination right now, and we are training soldiers. And we are going to continue to train soldiers in a safe environment with very, very strict measures that we talked about, from social distancing to screening to testing. And, again, we need to make sure that our Army is ready to go to war. And we're going to make sure that our soldiers are ready. We have an obligation to do that, so they will continue to train. We do have the testing capability. They've just received 2 of the Gen X 16 machines, along with 2 of the BioFire machines, so they do have the capability up to about, I think it's about little over 700 testing capability a day, and that will give them the capability that they need in the future to make sure that we can maintain the safety of the new recruits. They have 4 systems in place right now at Fort Jackson. 2 are called the BioFires. The BioFires do 24 a day each, so you got 24 a day each, and then they have 2 of these brand new Gen X 16s, and they're called 16s because they do 16 an hour. So if you times 16 by 24 and multiply that by 2, you get a little over 700. And then the capability is that's part of it. So you have the machine that has the capability to actually process the tests, and they can do that right there and fairly quickly.
U.S. Northern Command at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs is deploying 1,000 Air Force and Navy medical providers to New York. The rest will deploy to other areas around the state.
With more than 9 million confirmed cases, the nation has now broken a global daily new case record. The U.S. reported nearly 100,000 new cases in a single day.
We're testing first-time testers, so we're capturing people that are not in their data sets.
And that's because they trust coming to a place like this.
And that's what we believe.
She says as they test more members of the African American community, a mysterious trend is emerging. The black community has a much lower rate of infection.
We've tested close to 900 people at this point, and we've had 5 positives. 5.
The problem is, for black people who do contract the disease, the death rate is much higher than usual. Dr. Rhodes says that may be physiological or the result of inferior health care options. She's not sure. It hasn't been studied. But Brondon Reams, a pastor at another Oakland church, stopped by for a COVID antibody test and says, by and large, black people are taking the threat seriously.
Sure, there's a population of young people and different ones who are not, but the majority of us are trying to listen to the science, trying to follow the rules, and do what we need to do.
Right now, the questions all revolve around who is getting the disease, but that may be missing the point. Why do African American people have a lower infection rate? Are they doing something right that we're not doing?
I'm so glad you said that, because as we've been through, a number of tests, a number of different test locations around the city and seeing the same thing over and over again, I'm starting to wonder, should we be asking the question, what is it that is going right in the African American community with regard to this pandemic?
State and federal authorities have for weeks been in deep planning over how logistics for COVID-19 vaccine distribution will work when the time comes. Further complicating the issue, according to Governor Andrew Cuomo, is a new request, this one from the federal government, for a data sharing agreement before the receipt of any vaccines.
They want the name, they want the address, they want the date of birth, they want the ethnicity, they want the race, they want the sex, and then they want the ID number.
The governor says the ID numbers refer to passport, driver's license, and social security numbers. He also adds the agreement states the information would be used by the CDC, HHS, and other federal partners. It's why he's asking federal authorities for clarification on why, in a public health crisis, this disclosure would even be necessary. Meanwhile, COVID-19 numbers across the nation soar. Here in New York, the state remains with the third lowest rates across the country. Positivity rates in microcluster zones across the state, 3.5%. The state positivity rate, 1.7%, including those red zones, and a little less than 1.5% without. Faring better than other states, but defiance in some pockets continue. Over the weekend, hundreds of Halloween partygoers were busted in the Bronx and Brooklyn. The vast majority, according to the New York Sheriff's Department, not wearing masks, apparent through these photos released Sunday. And it is precisely what local and state officials are most worried about as the fight against COVID-19 carries on.
Effectively
the United States just topped 9 million confirmed coronavirus cases. The number of Americans dead in the pandemic has now surpassed 229,000 people.
People that don't take COVID serious, I hope they don't catch it because they're in for a surprise.
The average daily death toll from this disease, already rising, might triple between now and mid-January. Nearly 400,000 could be dead in America by February 1st. This, according to one regularly cited model. And if states don't reimpose measures to slow the spread, those modelers say the death toll might top 500,000.
Our hospitalizations are going up, individuals in the ICUs are going up, and sadly, we are losing more people. Right now, the problem isn't that we don't have the right rules in place, it's that people aren't following them.
In New Mexico, one doctor warns that if nothing else is done,
by December, we would have so many cases, we would be that point where we're in MASH tents.
This month, more than half of states have reported record daily case counts.
The virus is all over the country now. It's not limited to New York or Boston or the Northeast. It's all over the country now.
There's a spike in Illinois, a record today, and today Chicago closed all indoor restaurants and bars. There's also a spike in El Paso, Texas.
And if we don't respond, we will see unprecedented levels of deaths.
So that judge just closed all non-essential services for a couple of weeks. But the Texas Attorney General is now exploring legal action to reopen everything. No statewide mask mandate up in North Dakota, but a memorial to the dead created by Carl Jung. He's running for state assembly, lost his mother to COVID, now begging everyone to mask up.
The CDC director, Dr. Robert Redfield, just said that a silent epidemic of asymptomatic carriers is fueling this current outbreak. But when hotspot states are reporting testing positivity percentages, Sanjay, of 40 or even 50%, how difficult is it to find those asymptomatic carriers, especially young people, in the first place?
It's really challenging, Wolf. I mean, what does 40 to 50% positivity rate mean? I think most people know this, but test 100 people and 40 to 50 of them come back positive. What that means is there's a lot more people out there that you missed. It's kind of like the fishing metaphor that I've used with you, Wolf. You put a net down, get a bunch of fish come back in the net, you think, oh, there's a lot more fish down here. Get just one or two fish, you think, I've pretty much gotten them all. There's not probably a lot more there. So we're missing a lot of people. They don't know that they have the virus because they don't have symptoms. They're not getting tested, and they continue to spread. That's what Dr. Redfield's talking about. I mean, I interviewed him back in February, where he talked about the concern about asymptomatic spread. And, remind you, Wolf, quickly, 40% roughly of people are asymptomatic. 40%. Another 40% just have minimal symptoms. But here's the point. 50% of transmission is occurring before any of those symptoms develop. You don't know you have it, but you do.
Wide. The U.S. has been reporting the highest number of new cases since the summer. Hospitalizations are up in at least 30 states.
Good morning. One of those states is Utah, and that's where we're going to begin this morning. One of the largest hospitals in that region is over capacity. And quite frankly, what's happening there is simply unsustainable. And that's why they're about to open a field hospital in Utah.
And the president just a short time ago in his first coronavirus briefing since April, saying the pandemic, quote, will probably may unfortunately get worse before it gets better. And John asking whether there should be more money spent for testing for Americans still waiting for hours in blistering heat and then waiting more than a week in some cases for results. What the president says about that tonight. And this evening, the new report from the CDC revealing the number of infections here in the U.S. is likely 10 times higher than reported. Of course, the numbers that have been reported are already staggering. More than 141,000 lives have been lost, more than 1,000 more lives in just the last 24 hours, 58% of them in the South. More than 3.8 million confirmed cases. But that new estimate from the CDC could mean that tens of millions more Americans may have been infected, many without even knowing it. The study across 10 cities and states. And tonight in Florida, which remains the current epicenter, more than 9,000 new cases, 136 more deaths. One nurse telling us tonight her hospital has only one ICU bed left. Texas tonight also reporting more than 9,000 new cases. And in one Texas county alone, 85 babies have tested positive since March, and at least one infant has died. All of that driving the very real questions tonight about when and how schools should open. Congress today asking executives from top drug companies racing for a vaccine if they would send their own children back.
Coronavirus is pushing Utah's hospitals to the brink. The ICU at the University of Utah Hospital in Salt Lake City was at 104% capacity last Friday, and that forced patients into surge beds. But the newest member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force, Dr. Scott Atlas, who is not an expert in infectious diseases, posted a tweet on Saturday claiming that masks do not work. It was removed by Twitter for violating the site's policies against misinformation. Meanwhile, President Trump continues to call the efficacy of masks into question, even pointing to Dr. Anthony Fauci and his guidance from the early days of the pandemic as reason the president says we should all be skeptical.
And he said, do not wear a mask. So if we don't wear a mask, then they say, oh, wear a mask.
In a 60-minute...
The Defense Department has set a goal to be testing 60,000 troops a day for coronavirus. They've identified this as their requirement for the amount of tests that they're going to need to be able to process in order to get the entire force tested, but also to be able to periodically retest troops before deployments, before training exercises, perhaps before permanent change of station moves, just to make sure that no one is picking up coronavirus and then bringing it around the world to a new population. Now, they want to do this with a tiered approach, starting with some key national security units that they've identified. So submarine crews, Air Force nuclear bombing crews, basic trainees, making sure that new troops coming into the services don't have coronavirus, as well as some high-end special operations troops who are doing counter-terror missions in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria. Then after that, they want to start testing all deployed troops and then forward deployed troops. So troops who are stationed in Korea, Germany, Japan, those sorts of places, as well as anybody who's coming back from any sort of overseas deployment. What they really haven't identified, though, is the pace with which they intend to ramp up to 60,000, or how they're going to be able to get their hands on enough swabs, machines for analysis, and then just the sheer number of staff it's going to take to process 60,000 tests a day. And that's going to be the much bigger challenge.
We're going to start a pilot next week.
Chris Mazzola is the head of school at the Branson School, and at the start of the pandemic closures, she and her staff thought about ways to eventually return to school safely, and she knew just the student to reach out to.
I went to him in June, or May or June, and said, here's what I need. Do you think you can design something like this? And he said, I'm going to try, and he got back involved, and the two of them worked all summer.
Amrit Baveja is a senior at the school. He had already designed an app for the school its freshman year. He took up this challenge with fellow senior Beck Lorsch from the nearby Marin Academy. Together, they created Marin Trace.
They were having a lot of trouble finding existing contact tracing solutions that kind of fit all of their needs. And the system that they're currently using now is a basic check-in system.
I would describe it as an app that allows you to say whether or not you have COVID-19 symptoms before you come to campus,
The U.S. reported more than 99,000 new coronavirus cases Friday, more than any country has ever reported in a single day. The new COVID caseload over the past 3 days is around 262,000. Case numbers are rising in 44 of the 50 states. Health officials are especially concerned about infections in key Midwestern battleground states like Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
See, I think we got one.
Where are your hands going? It's the same thing in personal protection. They'll talk about, nobody's going to kill you with their expression on their face. They're going to kill you with their hands. And you got to watch your hands because this is mostly hand to mouth from what we can tell. And so wash them hands and wash them hands. They got to be really crispy or you're not doing it right. On a practical basis, I have been advocating for weeks that the United States military be fully mobilized. And that's not, people have an idea that what that means is a police occupation of the state. Yes, there may be needs for them to help with security issues. I happen to be someone who trusts them in humanitarian situations because I worked with them very, very closely in Haiti. But I'm not entirely sure about the Navy, but the Army and the Air Force in particular, they do have robust medical wings, as well as the ability through the Army Corps to build hospitals. And we should be taking the pressure off of the hospital system and the clinic system.
The first call was expected. After all, Brock Ballou's co-worker had tested positive for COVID-19, and he assumed a contact tracer would reach out. But he wasn't expecting what that tracer would say.
Yes, she specifically said, I'm looking at it right here, it says that you tested positive. We're just follow-up phone call to see how your symptoms are.
But Ballou was confused because he hasn't even been tested yet. Is it possible that you just misheard her? You misunderstood what she said?
I'm 100% sure that's what she said because she's looking right at it and she specifically told me, I'm looking right here in the system, that you're showing positive.
Then 2 more days of calls with tracers saying the same thing.
She says, well, I'm still seeing that you're positive. Just a courtesy call to check your symptoms.
Ballou shared with News 4 Investigates the 3 calls he's received. All phone numbers come from the state health department. Ballou's concern, if he is identified as positive in the state system, how accurate are the numbers they release every day?
I don't know what's going on, but it's wrong. And then I'm just another number when I'm not.
The state says they're now investigating, telling News 4 Investigates, quote, I can also tell you there is no concern with our count of cases in regard to our reporting of those who test positive. Those entries are based on lab results, not on information provided from the monitoring team. Ballou says he's been told by the state that a third-party contractor made the calls to him, and they're now investigating to find out what happened.
The Illinois National Guard now pitching in to open a new COVID testing center in Markham today. It is the state's 3rd site. The others are in Harwood Heights and downstate McLean. This site is a little different from others because they're handing out self-testing kits. Guard members then explain how the process works.
When you pull into the bay, you will be presented with a cart, and on that cart you will have the nasal swab. You will swab your nostrils about 15 seconds in each nostril, pass that off to the individual who is there, and then it gets packed up and sent to the lab. And in about 3 to 5 days, you can expect a call with the results.
This is a day of hope, where there are people in our community that wanted to get tested. This was not set up, and now they have a place to come to, and we want everybody to come out and please get tested.
An additional 80 Illinois Guardsmen are being deployed to support the response operations across the state. A total of 650 Guard members in total now helping in the coronavirus fight.
no point I will be touching the bag. So I'm just going to take the specimen, drop it in, take my gloves to my trash can back here.
And then each specimen, of course, is going to go
my gloves off, pre-sanitize, come back over. Again, he's going to grab me a new test.
Oh, no.
Any point in time, if you start to taste the stuff again, or the taste gets stronger, that means it's getting through your mask.
Slow and steady.
One issue that has come up is once you do have a vaccine, how do you properly distribute it? How do you get it out quickly to millions?
Well, when we
of
have the
people?
vaccine, we have the military all lined up, and the military is going to be doing it in a very powerful manner. These are people that don't usually do vaccines. They do soldiers, and they do lots of other things that, frankly, are more difficult. But we have our general, and logistically, he's all
Fighting what the
set.
president dubs the invisible army. An army lab closely studying the coronavirus as they try to find a way to win this war.
At Fort Detrick in Maryland, Army scientists are armed with face masks, rubber gloves, and test tubes. They are on the front lines in the fight against the coronavirus.
What we want to do is be able to prevent the disease, and the way to do that is through a vaccination. Some of the people here are going to be the heroes that are going to help us defeat it.
Our cameras rolling exclusively inside one of the military's most important research and medical facilities, U.S. AMRID. Researchers here growing a live sample of the coronavirus for testing, studying its characteristics and behavior to try and find what will prevent it.
Behind these glass windows, lab techs are beginning a 2 to 3 week long process of multiplying and purifying the virus to understand how it spreads.
As the pandemic sweeps across the world, a shortfall in treatment has sparked a global race to find a vaccine.
So this is actually a training lab that we use here at USAMRIID to train individuals on how to work in containment.
While scientists are working around the clock, a vaccine could still be 12 to 18 months away.
So it is a long road. Not only do you have to develop the vaccine, like in the laboratory, the science part of the vaccine, but then you have to take that vaccine and you have to put it into human clinical trials to show that that vaccine is safe.
And as millions practice social distancing, every day these doctors come into closer contact with the deadly virus than virtually anyone else. Scrubs, a set of rubber gloves taped down, a respirator, a full face shield, gown, and then another pair of gloves.
For the lab technicians that are on the forefront of this fight.
Yes, that is exactly what they would wear at USAMRIID when they're working with coronaviruses.
At the Army's Corps is a call to deploy, fight, and win, no matter what the mission is.
The coronavirus is one of the biggest threats to U.S. national security. With the number of cases in the U.S. growing larger than China or Italy, the government is taking drastic measures to fight the disease.
I want to assure the American people that we're doing everything we can each day to confront and ultimately defeat this horrible, invisible enemy. We're at war. In a true sense, we're at war.
President Trump activated the National Guard in California, New York, and Washington to help combat the spread of the virus.
And I want to thank our National Guard. Now, you did such a good job that I'm asking for 4 more from the president.
The administration emphasized that activating the National Guard is not an indication of a plan to move toward martial law.
Martial law is a very specific state of affairs and a very dire state of affairs where the military has taken over all the functions of civil government.
People's rights should be protected alongside their health and safety.
Some fear coronavirus may be used as an excuse to limit civil liberties in America. Others say the declaration of martial law would be ineffective in combating the disease and an abuse of power. So, how likely is it that martial law will be declared in the U.S. in response to the coronavirus outbreak? Martial law is commonly understood as when the military, and not the judicial system, acts as the supreme power, and armed forces control all aspects of government.
Martial law is a very extreme measure, very unusual measure, which is essentially the replacement of civilian government by military government.
When you bring the military out into a situation of martial law, what you're ultimately saying is we're no longer going to be patient with people's civil rights. We're no longer going to be patient with people's needs and excuses for why they may have to do something that the military doesn't want them to do. The military is ultimately designed to impose will by force. That's what the military is there for.
Martial law occurs only in dire circumstances, where either the local government is no longer able to control a situation or in instances of attacks. While martial law is distinct from the suspension of habeas corpus, the two may happen in tandem when martial law forces courts to close. Habeas corpus is Latin for that you have the body. A writ of habeas corpus means that a prisoner or other detainee must be brought before the court to determine if the person's imprisonment or detention is lawful. Following the over 3-year use of martial law in Hawaii, the Supreme Court's 1946 decision upheld a Civil War case that declared martial law is only constitutional when an emergency forces courts to close.
You can suspend habeas corpus under the Constitution in situations of insurrection or invasion. And so in situations of insurrection or invasion, it often is the case that the courts won't be open, the police won't be able to do their jobs, trash won't be able to be picked up in the ordinary way. So martial law might be necessary. And if martial law is necessary, it may very well be that habeas corpus gets suspended.
While enforcing a quarantine or social distancing orders during the coronavirus outbreak may feel like an infringement on civil liberties, it does not negate the presence of a judicial system and therefore does not suspend habeas corpus.
The social distancing that's being imposed in places like New York City and around the country right now would be much stricter, and your ability to violate those kinds of curfews would probably be much more curtailed if they were being enforced by soldiers.
In fact, advances in technology like video chat allow courts to stay open during isolation and quarantine.
A judge could sit across from them just like you and I are sitting right now and actually hear that case. And so there may not actually be a legitimate reason to suspend habeas corpus. And I'll give you one example of how that's actually played out in practice. Detainees in Guantanamo have habeas corpus here. They have been using this kind of video teleconference that we're all now growing accustomed to for about the past 15 years. I think advances in technology probably make the need to suspend habeas corpus far less than it ever was, when you literally had to go out and literally carry the body into a courtroom that was open. But it also may challenge the basic rules the courts have laid out in habeas corpus cases to understanding when we're in martial law and when martial law is actually truly justified. At the federal level, the power of the president to essentially declare martial law in parts of the country has traditionally only been authorized or approved by the courts where the state government is unwilling or unable to essentially enforce federal law.
People often talk about activating the National Guard as a sign martial law may be declared. Activating the National Guard does not mean that martial law is being enforced. It does mean that the local or state government may need extra assistance from the federal government. As of early April 2020, over 30,000 Air and Army National Guard members have been supporting coronavirus response efforts at the direction of their governors. They have helped build and outfit nearly 150 alternate care facilities, providing 83,000 extra beds.
The state government runs most of the day-to-day functions of the government. It's called the police powers. So even quarantines within a state are entirely done by the state. The federal government, by law, only has the authority to use federal power to enforce quarantines between states or at borders.
The National Guard is a unique body that reports to the governor of a state, but may also be called upon for federal responsibilities.
National Guard units can operate essentially under one of three different kinds of statuses. So the first would be state active duty, which is largely what's happening now. The oversight and the command and control authority rests with the civilian governor. There's also something called Title 32 duty, and I'm simplifying when I say that the National Guard troops may be deployed in the service of the United States. They can be federally paid for, but they remain under the control of each state's civilian governor. And then there's something which is more rare, which is Title 10 duty, when the National Guard is deployed by the president for a federal purpose.
The National Guard is often called upon in times of natural disasters, civil unrest, domestic emergencies, and more.
In situations where the president feels that the governor is failing to comply with federal law or is in some way or another resisting federal law, the president can take over the National Guard unilaterally and use it to carry out and protect federal law.
So in this pandemic, if state civilian agencies and resources are overwhelmed and unable to avert disaster, National Guard personnel may provide supporting humanitarian assistance requested by states' governors under civilian leadership and oversight. The National Guard's role in providing this humanitarian assistance should be transparent, it should be time limited, it should be subject to civil rights safeguards and accountability and public oversight.
The National Guard Bureau told CNBC the response is neighbors helping neighbors. The National Guard will conduct these missions in a professional and friendly manner.
I think people should be careful about throwing around the idea and concept of martial law, both because I think it unnecessarily scares people, but it also unnecessarily normalizes an idea that we don't want to normalize. If we treat every use of the military, particularly the National Guard, as encroaching martial law, then you're lowering the threshold for what martial law means.
Martial law has been enacted a few times throughout U.S. history, most significantly during the Civil War and following the attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II.
People point to Hawaii because that is the classic example of replacement of civilian government by military government.
Or you were forced to give blood.
We know this from history, that the government is prone to committing abuses in times of crisis, and we must ensure that broad claims of power are not misused beyond legitimate needs. And we're watching closely to make sure that that doesn't happen.
The U.S. can look to the international community for how successful martial law may be in combating the virus.
One can think of the People's Republic of China. The use of very stringent measures, primarily quarantine and aggressive social distancing measures, but also aggressive testing and even isolation of people who show symptoms, seems to have proven to be effective.
The National Guard Bureau said there has been no discussion about using the National Guard to enforce a nationwide quarantine, and that the National Guard remains under the control of state governors.
I don't think we're anywhere close to martial law. The society has not broken down to the point where the military is necessary in order to keep society running. But I think we all should be very concerned about whether or not our civil government, if we're funding it enough, that we're giving it the resources and requiring the people who are running our government to be competent enough to actually carry on the functions of government without having to resort to the military.
We're assisting the state's efforts in combating the COVID-19.
The Illinois National Guard has set up camp, specifically a medical testing camp at the old vehicle admissions testing facility on Forest Preserve Drive on the northwest side, to test off-duty first responders, firefighters, police officers, and other frontline medical personnel who worry they may have come in contact with someone who has COVID-19.
We've had a pretty heavy response. It showed up early in the morning, a couple hours before testing.
The response has been so big that a line of cars have stretched down the street, and the facility has had to shut down after just a few hours because it's reached its first come, first serve, 250 tests per day limit.
We're used to fighting wars in the military, but here we're, I guess, fighting germs. So that's what I told my kids before I came.
Captain Jamie Noblet is a family nurse practitioner from downstate Robinson.
It's a nasopharyngeal swab, so we are decked out in full PPE. We're not doing detailed exams by any means. We're taking their temperature, so we've had several with increased temperature.
Private First Class Jeremiah Johnson, who's from Chicago, is responsible for collecting the first responders' information.
Just want to make sure that this virus doesn't spread more than it has been in the last few weeks.
Specialist Alnar Johnson, also from Chicago, is responsible for packaging the test kits. She has a message for everyone.
Just want to tell them to stay safe, keep themselves hydrated, motivated, prayers, and just stay in the house until they further notice.
Now, family members and retirees are not eligible. You have to bring a department-issued identification to prove that you are a first responder.
On January 20th, South Korea confirmed its first case of COVID-19. The same day, the United States also confirmed its first case of COVID-19. But what happened next in both countries was really different. This chart shows, for several countries, the number of COVID-19 tests performed relative to the population. Right away, South Korea started aggressively testing for the virus. Before long, it had conducted more tests per 1,000 people than any other country. Most experts say that testing at that scale is the key to safely opening public spaces.
We need to test and trace.
We need more testing.
The larger the outbreak you have of the virus, the more tests you should be doing.
It's why South Korea was able to avoid a broad lockdown. The US was much slower to ramp up their testing, but eventually, in mid-April, they caught up to South Korea. As of mid-May, about 3% of the US population had been tested for COVID-19. And now some parts of the US are starting to reopen. But some experts warn that in many of those places, reopening is premature. That even though the US has been doing a lot more testing, they haven't been testing the right people. Because South Korea ramped up testing so quickly in those first few weeks, they were able to track down lots of people who have the virus and isolate them so that everyone else could go back to work. And most experts agree that if you send people back to work without doing this first, it's really dangerous.
Testing is like response 101. It's the most obvious thing we need to do in any disease outbreak.
That's because if a country doesn't test effectively, they don't really know where the virus is and how many people have it. This chart shows, for each of these countries, what percentage of all of their COVID-19 tests have come back positive up until mid-May. It's called the test positivity rate. This number doesn't tell us what percentage of people in each country have COVID-19, but you can think of it as an easy way to see which countries are doing enough testing to contain their outbreak.
We would certainly like to see countries testing at the level of 10 negative tests to 1 positive.
That's 10%. In other words, the countries below this line have done a better job testing. And that's because this number can tell us a lot about who in a country is actually getting tested and how.
What we know about this disease is there are a lot of people who have very mild symptoms, who have actually no symptoms at all, and we're almost surely not testing those people.
In the US, COVID-19 tests were in short supply for a long time, and that shaped the Center for Disease Control's guidelines on how healthcare workers should allocate testing, prioritize people showing up to hospitals with the most severe symptoms. If that's where testing is focused, it makes sense that a large portion of people tested will test positive. But it also means you are missing anyone who isn't actively seeking out those tests. This is a reactive testing scenario. It's probably what happened in other countries with high test positivity rates. And to understand why that matters, we can look at countries that also experienced a big outbreak but have a lower test positivity rate, like Australia, Germany, and South Korea. Instead of narrowly focusing on testing the very sick, these countries tested proactively. They tested a much wider group of people, including many who didn't feel sick at all.
They're testing lots and lots of people, and they're probably picking up everybody.
That led to a lot of negative results, which drove their positive rate lower. And because they tested so many people, their test didn't only find people with severe symptoms, but also those with mild symptoms, and even many who tested positive but had no symptoms at all. And these are the people who are key to containing an outbreak. If someone doesn't feel very sick, it's unlikely they will seek out a test, which means you have to find them. And when testing is only reserved for the sickest, these people who do feel sick often don't make the cut. If you chart the United States test positivity rate over time, you can see it's been going down, which could be a sign the US is starting to test more effectively. But if you break it out by state, you can see that some places still have a long way to go. In a reactive testing scenario, the severely symptomatic people may have gotten tested, but the mildly symptomatic and the asymptomatic are mingling with people who don't have COVID-19. To find those people and lower the test positivity rate, there are two options. One approach is to cast the net wide and randomly test as many people as possible.
If you just blanket the country with tests, anybody who wakes up every morning, every other day, if you want to go get a test, you can get a test. Every time you go to work, you can get a test. Asymptomatic people are getting picked up just by the fact that everybody's getting tested all the time.
This would require a huge increase in testing. In the first week of May, the US was averaging about 260,000 tests a day. But a random testing approach could require tens of millions of daily tests. The other approach requires less testing, but is more targeted, starting with the people we already know tested positive for COVID-19.
You isolate them, but you also talk to them about all their contacts, everybody they have spent any time with. And then you go test all those people. And some of them are going to be asymptomatic, and you're going to pick up asymptomatic disease through contact tracing.
Experts like Dr. Jha say that approach would require more like 900,000 daily tests. But in both scenarios, the goal is the same.
The entire math of this comes down to one simple idea. You want to keep infected people away from susceptible people. That's it.
Today, sir, I'm going to put up pictures here. This is 30 people in the Oval Office while the president's on a speakerphone, and you're seeing nobody's wearing a mask. Not Ambassador O'Brien, not Jared Kushner. There's one woman there is wearing a mask, and that is it. 30 people, you know the size of that Oval Office. I mean, that is a violation of what a good practice is it not?
Yeah, I think what you're going to hear, Chuck, with some validity to it, but then again, the image is not optimal for people to see, is that virtually everybody who's in that room was tested that day to go into the Oval Office. But still, the image of that is something that may give the wrong impression to people. Now, if you're looking at it, there's a number of states, about 30 some odd states have picked up and ticked up into a level where they're increasing. That information, I think, could be public knowledge when Dr. Birx, who spends a lot of time collecting that data, she's right now on the road going to different states trying to get some public health message there. But I believe that information can be made public. I don't understand why not.
Nearly 2 weeks after his parents' diagnosis with COVID-19, Melania Trump confirmed that 14-year-old Barron Trump also tested positive. Although the Trump administration previously said on October 2nd that the teen had not contracted the virus, the First Lady detailed her son's experience with the illness in a personal essay posted on the White House website. She revealed, "My fear came true when he was tested again, and it came up positive. Luckily, he is a strong teenager and exhibited no symptoms. In one way, I was glad the three of us went through this at the same time, so we could take care of one another and spend time together. He has since tested negative." The First Lady, who said she has also since tested negative, continued by describing her symptoms. She wrote, "I experienced body aches, a cough, and headaches, and felt extremely tired most of the time. I chose to go a more natural route in terms of medicine, opting more for vitamins and healthy food." Unlike her husband, Donald Trump, Melania was not hospitalized for treatment. Instead, her spokeswoman Stephanie Grisham told CNN that she remained quarantined at the White House residence. Melania, who hopes to resume her duties soon, explained that she used that downtime to reflect on her family and the state of the country. Meanwhile, the president was discharged from Walter Reed Medical Center on October 6th, 4 days after he and his wife tested positive.
The pandemic crushed travel here and really around the world. The TSA is reporting agents screened more than 1 million people in one day at U.S. airports this weekend. And for all of last week, more than 6 million. travel is increasing. It's the best week since mid-March. Hawaii is now seeing an uptick in visitors since dropping its mandatory 14-day quarantine rule.
I'm here.
You don't think
look, Hawaii has to balance two things: a 12.5% unemployment rate and a 2.2 COVID positivity rate. And it is unique among the states. It has no borders. It can really control who comes in. And for the last 7 months, basically, nobody could come in here unless they were willing to stay at home for 2 weeks and not go outside. And believe me, they were hitting up violators big time. Thousands of dollars in fines. Even the Surgeon General got pinged. So here's the economic impact. Look at this. Back in January, they had on average 28,000 arrivals a day. That plunged to a little over 700 this summer. Then there was Thursday's reopening when over 10,000 people showed up. That was a huge snapback. Caught airport officials off guard. My little home videos don't really show the magnitude. So many people arrived who hadn't followed all the rules instituted beforehand. Officials became a little overwhelmed. Let me kind of walk you through an example of those rules. Look, if you come to Hawaii, you have to first go on the state website, fill out a form if you don't want to quarantine. You get this QR code. Then before you come here, you have to go get a Hawaii-approved COVID test at a Hawaii-sanctioned, trusted site on the mainland before you can even come here. And that has to be done 72 hours before you land.
That sounds like a lot.
Well, it wasn't easy, by the way. You have to pay for that COVID test. We paid $128, and to find a trusted site, take a look. The closest one we could find was 80 miles away at a Walmart in Palmdale. And we didn't get the results until we were in the air when we landed on Saturday, so that was fun. Then when we land, you got to check out this video because my husband's in it. We came to the big line. Now, only this island, you have to get a second test, a rapid antigen test at the airport. He was a good sport about it. And you can't leave till you get a negative antigen test. If you're positive, you have to get another PCR test, and then you got to quarantine. Some people were taking hours to get out of here. For us, it was pretty good. But once you're out, Shep, if you look at my little driving videos, the island is wide open. The beaches are open. There isn't any traffic. You do notice the homeless more, and the police seem to be trying to get a handle on that starting yesterday. Many hotels, Shep, are not open yet. Some restaurants not fully open. But hey, it's Hawaii.
Yes, it is. What happened to all
open the North Atlantic? And if so, when could we potentially see that happening?
Yes, absolutely. This is a great first step in the direction of opening travel, North Atlantic or otherwise. But as we discussed before, it really depends on governments accepting the tests. And there are two really critical conditions here. Number one, how reliable are those tests? And secondly, do governments actually put the rules in place that you actually can use the test to get into the country and not be burdened by any quarantine restrictions, for example.
So is the idea that you get tested kind of going into Heathrow and then you fly to New York and then it proves that you're good to go and then you're let loose? Like, is that in theory the goal?
That's the dream, I'd say. What's more likely is that actually it makes more sense to test you on the way out of the airport, quite honestly. We've seen several proposals in the industry calling for testing at point of disembarkation, so where you arrive. Most likely, if we're talking about the transatlantic air bridge, so there's the project American and BA are working on to link JFK and Heathrow, which would call for testing on both sides, so going into the airport and coming out of the airport, and then you're let loose. But of course, you would still be faced with the general restrictions that exist for the population wherever you're going.
So we've been working in partnership, as you say, with Swissport and with Heathrow and with John Holland-Kate's team very closely. This is about a next stage in moving travel and opening up the borders. We know that a number of countries are putting in pre-departure requirements. That means you've got to have a test, you've got to be testing negative before boarding a plane and then flying. This facility here makes that very easy for the passenger. They come on to the airport an hour earlier than they would do normally. They test, they get their result, they could board their plane and they can move on with their travels as they would do normally.
This is a political battle because you know way better than I do that the battles that the owners and the CEOs of Heathrow and Gatwick and other airports have had with the government saying, we can do this, we can have a testing regime. So the government's watching you and watching how this works as well. Are you feeling the pressure?
I think we're not feeling the pressure. We've got a team of absolute experts here, medical professionals who really understand what they're doing. We've got the science behind us. We know that testing is something which allows people to go about their business. It keeps economies flowing. It has to be part of our solution over the next 6 to 12 months. So I don't think we're feeling the pressure. We're just very keen to get this live, not just for places like Hong Kong that we're doing today, but more internationally and more broadly, and to start getting bilateral agreements between countries to ensure that cross-border travel is as simple as it can be.
Correct me if I'm wrong, it's 80 quid, 80 pounds, I should say, it's less colloquial, 80 pounds, and it takes an hour as well. You're not going to be able to get the big scale up while it's still that price and that long, are you?
So I think where we are at the moment is this is a requirement that we've got, this requirement for certain countries. We're hopeful that as this evolves, we'll start to use antigen tests as well. They're quicker and they're cheaper, but it's a question of this is stage one. So certainly if you're doing a long haul business flight, £80 is not something which is going to deter you. Clearly it does for a quick weekend away to Europe with a family. So there's always going to be different choices. Our key thing is to get the site up and running. Then we continue to evolve the testing that we can do and make sure that it can cater for a broader audience.
David, this is part of the equation, and again, I've started this. I was talking to Stuart Wingate on the tarmac at Gatwick a few weeks ago, as well as hoping to get more EasyJet flights going as well. This is part of the equation. What else needs to be in place for this to work?
So I think that one of the other things that we're exploring is we're working with one of our partners, Common Pass, and that is about making sure that actually you can get a digital passport that also validates when you can travel. So we're working with Common Pass, we're working with the World Economic Forum, we're working with governments to have a standardized approach to ensure that people know when you've had a test from a validated, authenticated laboratory, you're safe to travel. I think that's something which, once we really get cross-border and the same regulation across countries to make sure that we can use standard technology, that will make things really open up.
And we thank your families who exhibit a very special kind of courage, knowing you are headed into the breach to save others.
Our Air Force and medical airmen are partnering with other American heroes and our international teammates to meet the challenge this pandemic has placed before us.
We're Texans helping Texans. We're just kind of helping out the civilian counterparts here to kind of ensure that everyone, whether it's rural or city areas, gets an opportunity to be tested.
17 members of the Texas Military Department were in San Angelo Wednesday facilitating a free COVID-19 testing site. The Texas Military Department is operating rural testing sites throughout the state with a goal to reach rural communities with limited access to COVID-19 tests. Last week, Shannon Medical Center announced a shortage in testing supplies for COVID-19, limiting the ability for widespread testing.
This is free to the public. Obviously, our main goal is to make it easy and essentially efficient for people to be able to get tested.
The department administered nearly 120 tests. Unlike the city of San Angelo's testing site, citizens did not need to have symptoms of COVID-19 to be tested.
The public response has been real good, so I'm happy for that. I want to keep them busy and not feel like that we wasted their time and energy and resources by coming out.
The Texas Military Department also facilitated a testing site in El Dorado on Wednesday. They're scheduling a mobile testing event in Ozona at the Crockett EMS station on Thursday.
40% of people with COVID-19 have no symptoms at all.
Doctors say countless people who don't even know they have coronavirus are spreading it, fueling a surge across the country and in Boston. Finding those people, they say, is key to controlling outbreaks.
It's not about the number of tests right now and the reagents. That was a really big issue in the beginning, in the early days. Today, it's about the logistics of deploying those tests to where they need to be and giving access to those tests.
Dr. Shira Daron is the hospital epidemiologist at Tufts Medical Center. She says testing availability is limited for people who don't show symptoms or whose insurance may not cover the cost.
2 new testing sites open in Jersey City today. This is a walk-up testing site at the city's public safety headquarters on Marine Boulevard. A drive-through testing site also open at the former Department of Public Works complex on Route 440. Both sites will follow an appointment-only system.
Even as we get closer to a vaccine
public health experts say that testing for COVID-19 will need to remain a top priority through the end of next year. Some scientists are pushing to make it as routine as brushing your teeth. But for now, the highly accurate PCR test done in a lab is the gold standard. We got a closer look inside the company Curative, which has done 4 million tests in less than 6 months.
As COVID cases surge, it's being fought swab by swab. After a slow start, the nation's COVID testing operation has been humming, the samples pouring into labs like this one run by testing startup Curative, where ABC News got an exclusive look at the operation, processing nearly 10% of the nation's daily tests.
This is all designed to have scale-up capacity to 100,000 samples per day.
The Trump administration says more than 120 million COVID tests will be available nationwide in October, but far fewer Americans are actually being tested, only around 1 million per day, less than 30 million per month.
I think people are confused. They don't know what to do, whether to get a test.
Do you want people to go get tested?
We definitely want people to be tested. If you're symptomatic, you need to get tested. If you've been in close contact with a person known to have the disease, you should get tested. We need to have many individuals tested on a routine basis who are asymptomatic with no known exposure.
Companies designing at-home tests tell ABC News they're able to manufacture millions of tests a day and could have them widely available immediately.
We should probably be doing something like 20 million tests per day.
The federal government isn't sold on the idea. The FDA has concerns about accuracy and sensitivity. A majority of Americans believe widespread testing is the key to a return to normal activities.
So there's 300 Americans right here who have swabbed themselves. Their samples are in these vials.
Exactly.
But no amount of testing can completely eliminate the virus from spreading or provide a free pass to those who get tested.
You can't rely on that as sort of your card to say it's okay to get together. And I wouldn't risk my family's life, my mother's life on that.
He did all the things right. He checked his symptoms online with the survey. When he qualified for a test, he then made an appointment online with Test Utah. Came to a drive-through testing location, got the test done in his car, then never got those results back.
The date collected, which is October 2nd, and the date his specimen was finally released, which is October 19th. That's a big delay to now be being notified that your test was unable to be tested.
Carrie Leonard has questions. Mainly, why did it take 17 days for her son to find out his COVID test results were inconclusive?
You know, did they lose his test? Did they mislabel his test? I mean, nobody knows.
They weren't given a direct reason from Test Utah. He went to this location of theirs at the Provo Town Center and waited 5 days before calling to check on results. That's when he was told that they were experiencing delays.
Yes, they said it can take up to 7 to 10 business days.
But that's not specified anywhere on Test Utah's website. I was told by a Test Utah representative that they were dealing with delays, but we weren't told why and for how long.
It's discouraging.
After 10 business days, Leonard's son went to a local clinic and got a negative test result back within 24 hours.
We need to start right now, 2020, about a year before the first vaccine is realistically available, with a huge public education effort to combat disinformation. Between now and then, we have to be very honest because we're in trials with these vaccines.
We can and will develop a vaccine. The question mark is, how effective will that vaccine be? And more importantly and more worryingly, who will get that vaccine? And will that distribution be fair and equitable?
Even if essentially there's enough for almost everybody at some point, how do you convince people to get the shots? Do you force them? Because the biggest problem, the biggest psychological and political problem of this, once we have a vaccine, will be the anti-vax movement or the distrust or the conspiracy theories, to put it in I think the more realistic way, that will actually prevent a large portion of Americans and people in many, many other countries from volunteering to get the shots. And that actually defeats the purpose, because you need about 3 and 4 people in a population to get the shots to build herd immunity and stop the virus.
believing that magically we will get a perfect vaccine that everyone will have access to is also not realistic.
I believe there are three issues. One is the international political environment, because this is a pandemic, this is a global effort. Do we treat it the way we treated smallpox 40 years ago, where we essentially were in this together? Or do we treat it as a my nation first, Germany first, America first, China first problem? And then the second problem is within each country, how do we essentially agree on a triage? And the third problem is the anti-vax movement, and how do we persuade people to get the shots? Because I'm telling you, not enough people will. When we know scientifically that a vaccine is safe and effective, then we have to explain that so widely. It has to be like basically the biggest public education push ever.
Several U.S. states on Thursday reported record single-day increases in COVID-19 infections. Further evidence that the pandemic is accelerating anew as cooler weather takes hold in many parts of the country. In the month of October alone, 28 states have reported their daily record high of COVID-19 cases. And on Thursday, Indiana, North Dakota, Illinois, and several other states posted daily records, according to a Reuters analysis. It comes a day after the number of coronavirus deaths reported across the country reached its highest in 2 months. Along with spikes in cases and deaths, the number of COVID-19 patients in U.S. hospitals climbed to a 2-month high. In Wisconsin, a COVID-19 hotspot, where this week Milwaukee residents waited in a long line of vehicles to get tested, hospitals are feeling the strain.
I feel like we're at the limits of overwhelming the health system right now.
In Madison, Wisconsin, Dr. Alexandra Wick says just weeks ago she had no patients with COVID-19. Now all her patients have the coronavirus.
And a state that keeps adding to the numbers, Jose, about 14,000 new infections in the last 3 days. Hospitalization rates have remained stable, but in Miami-Dade County, where I am, we're starting to see a bit of an uptick in COVID patients. I'm told that hospital officials here are preparing with more remdesivir and staffing. Jose?
I know it's been a difficult year for Americans, but we are going to come through this on the other side. I'm also optimistic that we'll have a limited supply of one or more COVID vaccines available for distribution before the end of this year.
Unfortunately, we're seeing a distressing trend here in the United States with COVID-19 cases increasing in nearly 75% of the country.
There is some recent data that has been determined that an individual who had a series of shorter contacts, but over time added up to more than 15 minutes, became infected. And clarifying that new science, that new data into our contact recommendation is what you're alluding to. And again, it's based on data that one didn't have 4 months ago.
Was that a problem we don't think about in lockdowns is that they're very nationalistic. That if we lock down our economy, then it hits our economy. But it also means we are not buying stuff. We're not trading with weaker economies. We are not just destroying our own jobs, we're destroying the jobs of all those that in the poorer parts of the world that export to us. That seemed to me to be a reasonable point.
Really important point by Professor Gupta. I want to say it again. We in the World Health Organization do not advocate lockdowns as a primary means of control of this virus. The only time we believe a lockdown is justified is to buy you time to reorganize, regroup, rebalance your resources, protect your health workers who are exhausted. But by and large, we'd rather not do it. Just look at what's happened to the tourism industry, for example, in the Caribbean or in the Pacific, because people aren't taking their holidays. Look what's happened to smallholder farmers all over the world because their markets have got dented. Look what's happening to poverty levels. It seems that we may well have a doubling of world poverty by next year. We may well have at least a doubling of child malnutrition because children are not getting meals at school and their parents in poor families are not able to afford it. This is a terrible, ghastly global catastrophe, actually. And so we really do appeal to all world leaders. Stop using lockdown as your primary control method. Develop better systems for doing it. work together and learn from each other. But remember, lockdowns just have one consequence that you must never, ever belittle, and that is making poor people an awful lot